Well, you have to listen to me one more time. It's a real honor tonight to welcome JD Vance to the podium. He's 35 years old and he's already lived a lifetime of accomplishment. As all of you know, he is running for the Senate seat in Ohio and the Republican ticket there. He grew up in the Rust Belt in some really challenging times and a challenging ambiance. He grew up in Middleton, Ohio, and then moved to Lexington, Kentucky, and which is right in the heart of the Rust Belt, and amidst churning poverty. And with that churning poverty, too, he memorialized it with a wonderful book called Hillbilly Elegy. And this book really talks about what it's like to grow up in that atmosphere and to be sort of moved out of it amidst all of the challenges of upward mobility. A very sensitive book which Archbishop Chaput just recommended to everybody and said that's a very moving and sensitive book. I just want to say a few things. After he completed high school, he joined the Marine Corps, and then after the Marine Corps, he went to Iraq, and then served in Iraq. He then went back to the Ohio State University, and then went to Yale Law School. Tonight, he will be speaking with us about politics and culture as he sees it, and he'll be doing this in a conversation with Brian Bursch from Catholic Vote. So it's with a real pride that we welcome JD Vance to the floor here with Brian Bursch.
Whoa. Well, thank you, everyone. On behalf of the Napa Institute, I'd like to welcome our special guest this evening. We're certainly delighted to have you with us for this conversation. We're especially grateful, as you know, because as a political candidate running for office these days, it can be a bit dangerous. Every move you make is publicly scrutinized. What you say tonight might very quickly become a topic on Twitter, and maybe, if you're lucky, a campaign ad. We're certainly happy to know that mingling with faithful Catholics is, at least not yet, something for which is a risk not worth taking. That said, if you poke around the internet, and I certainly have a little lately, you might begin to wonder, given what I've read, the Napa Institute Conference isn't what it might appear. According to some, this gathering is where the Catholic 1% gather to sip wine, swap MAGA stories, and receive our marching orders from Tim Bush. And yet here we are with the honored guest of our keynote this evening, a man who calls himself a hillbilly. So let's go ahead and start there, JD. You're widely known as one of the best-selling author of your memoir, now a Netflix movie produced by Ron Howard, starring Amy Adams and Glenn Close. Many of us here, I believe, have read the book. Tell us about that book, why you wrote it, and how has it been received?
Yeah, so first, just let me say thanks to Tim Bush and to the folks at the Napa Institute, to you, Bill, for hosting me and for having this conversation. I was planning actually originally to stay at the hotel tonight, but I have an event in Ohio I need to get to tomorrow, so I decided to take a red-eye flight. And so there are two important things if you're going to take a red-eye flight. The first is that you get some sleep. The second is that you don't get dehydrated. So I have both my water and my wine that I'll be drinking up here during this conversation. So don't judge me for that. So why did I write this book? I mean, at the time, I really just wanted to tell a story about people that I felt like didn't have stories told about them. And, I'd heard people talk about the American dream and the problems of the Rust Belt, the decline of the industrial Midwest, the the fact that so many people felt like they couldn't get ahead. And yet I felt like those problems were always told in a very academic way. Like I'm a big fan of Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart. It's a very interesting book. It's a very smart book. But Coming Apart is a book by a very sociologically minded person about a very sociological problem. But I felt like people, if they actually wanted to really understand these problems, they needed to get a sense of what it actually looked like, what it actually felt like. And so to me, the American dream wasn't this abstract thing that was interesting from the perspective of political science or sociology. It was the story of my family. And so I thought that if I told a story about not just the problems that exist in the community, but about the people who were experiencing them, my mom, my sister, my grandma, my dad, that they would actually gain an appreciation for these people as people. And they would, instead of having maybe a fake sympathy or a certain amount of judgment, they would actually understand a little bit about where communities like mine actually came from. And so I decided to write the book. It's funny, when I decided to write the book, I didn't think that many people would actually read it. So, the Thanksgiving after the book came out, so the book came out, I think, in June of 2016. The November of 2016, we had Thanksgiving dinner. My uncle, who really is the source of so many of the family stories that are in the book because he's the oldest of my mom's siblings. And my Uncle Jimmy was talking about how the book had sort of completely blown away his expectations. And he said, JD, I kind of wish you hadn't put some of these family stories, like aired the family dirty laundry in this book. And I said, well, Uncle Jimmy, you gave me all these stories. Like some of these stories happened from 30 years before I was born. You gave me all these stories. So it's really your fault. And he said, well, yeah, I gave you all these stories, but I didn't think anybody would actually read it. And I guess that's sort of how a lot of us reacted to the book. And that's why I think it was so open and so raw and so honest. I didn't think anybody would actually read it. And if I had known that so many people would, I probably wouldn't have written the same book.
So you've lived in New England. You've lived in Silicon Valley on the West Coast. With your professional experience, you could have lived in any city in the United States or even the world. But you chose to go home to Ohio. You're now 36 years old. You're married. You have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. And you're running to be the next senator from Ohio. What should people here know about Ohio?
Yeah, well, based on that response, by the way, I should say jdvance.com if you want to learn how to help what we're doing. All of those of you clapped, please go to jdvance.com. If not, your claps were all in vain. But I mean, the first thing that you should know about Ohio is that we have, and there are many great things about Ohio, but we have the worst state flag, I think. And it's, people ask me, what don't I like about Ohio? And it's the state flag because it's shaped in a really weird way. I wish we had just good colors, good scheme, but I wish we had a better state flag. The second thing to know is that I really think it's, and I'm biased obviously, but I think it's the most beautiful state in the country naturally. So, we have in Ohio, we have beautiful lakes and streams. We have the Appalachian Mountains in Ohio. We have Lake Erie, so we have beaches. I joke with my wife, who's from San Diego. She says, well, we don't have beaches in Ohio. And I'm like, honey, have you ever been to Lake Erie? We have beaches in Ohio. She says that's not the same thing, but we can, I won't try to sell that marital dispute here. But I think the thing that I love most about Ohio, and the reason I wanted to move back home, is because I wanted my kids to grow up around the same types of people that I grew up around. And there's just a basic practical component of this. I wanted my kids to grow up around the aunts, the uncles, my sister, my mom. I wanted them to have actually, day-to-day exposure to the people who made me who I was. But I also wanted them to just know what Ohio was like. I felt like it was, for all of the fact that I did not have a traditional childhood, that it was not easy, I felt like I lived my life with some of the best people in the world. And Justice Clarence Thomas, who I don't know well, but I've had a couple of very, very in-depth conversations with Justice Thomas, once told me that when you go from a pretty troubled background, or at least an underprivileged background, I put that in scare quotes, to spending a lot of time with people who've done very well in the world of business and politics and government and so forth, you realize how nice it was to not grow up with everything handed to you. You realize how nice it is to grow up around people who are really salt of the earth. And I wanted my kids to have that same experience. And I think that the thing that I would say most about Ohio is that people there whatever walk of life they come from, whatever their religion or race, whatever class they come from, they feel a certain pride in where they come from and their families and their communities. And I think that's a really admirable trait, and I'm glad that my kids get exposure to it every day.
So you were raised a non-denominational Christian. I understand you were never baptized. You've also said you went through an angry atheist phase, as you called it. But in 2019, you took the plunge, and you were received into the Catholic Church.
Thank you.
Tell us about that journey.
Well, first, it's good to be home, and I do think the Catholic Church is my home. But I'm reminded of something my mamaw once told me. You know, when you're in Marine Corps boot camp, you don't get to make phone calls home. You can only write letters. And I was always writing letters home to mamaw, and she would write me 1, 2, sometimes even 3 times a day. I got so many letters from mamaw. And, you know, one of my favorite Marine Corps boot camp letters is that I asked mamaw, you know, there are the Catholic church, the people go to Catholic church, the people go to Protestant church. Why do the Catholics get to go to church for so long, right? The Catholics always go to church for much longer. And that's like the best thing you do in boot camp, because that's the one thing where the drill instructors don't yell at you the whole time. And she said, you know, honey, just go to the Catholic service. Like, it doesn't matter. Just go to the Catholic service. Because in southeastern Kentucky, where she was from, she said even the Episcopalians are snake handlers. So this doesn't really matter. It's all, to her, it was all about Jesus. Even though the Catholic Church was a little foreign to her, it was all about Jesus. And you know, to me, look, there are all these ways that I could over-intellectualize the way that I became a Catholic. I mean, the simple fact is, I think that Christianity, broadly speaking, answered important questions about character and virtue that my elite educational credentials were not answering for me. I think that at Yale Law School, where I went to law school, is all about get the best degree, go to the best school, get the best job. And these things weren't making me a good person, but Christianity was asking me to ask much more important questions, like how do you treat this girl that you've fallen in love with, the girl that I eventually married? How do you be a good person? How do you eventually become a good father? That to me was a fundamentally Christian worldview, and so that led me back to Christianity writ large. But why did I become a Catholic? I mean, there are all these things that I could point to, but you know, one, I really liked that the Catholic Church was just really old. I felt like the modern world was constantly in flux. The things that you believed 10 years ago were no longer even acceptable to believe 10 years later. The Catholic Church was just very old. I liked the fact that I felt like it had stood really strong on some of the core moral issues. You know, I'm a very pro-life person. I've been pro-life since I was 14 years old. But I think anybody who's looked at the history of the American Christian conservative movement would give a lot of credit to the Catholic Church for pushing that movement in a more pro-life direction, especially in the 1970s. But it was just, you know, a lot of the people who were really, really influential to me as I thought about how to be a good Christian in this new era of my life were Catholics. One of the great things about coming to this conference, I've gotten to reconnect with Father Dominic Legg. Father Dominic was the first person the first priest that I spoke to about becoming a Catholic, and just a lot of really good people who took their faith very seriously were Catholics, and it felt like a natural home for me.
So I don't need to tell you, as even a young Catholic, about the struggles of our church in recent years. The abuse scandals, our internal fights over doctrine and leadership, and of course the larger threats posed by the secular culture. We are indeed the church founded by Jesus Christ, but of course made up of sinners, always in need of reform and renewal. You chose St. Augustine as your patron saint.
Sure.
How do you see the challenges confronting our church today?
You know, the first thing I'd say is that the challenges facing the church are in some ways nothing new. That's one of the great things about having a 2,000-year-old church, is that the church has gone through ups and downs, and I think it's gone through many down periods, much worse than anything we confront in 2021 Catholic America. I think that, you know, one of the problems that we have is that we're not totally sure how to deal with internal, what should be family disputes within the Catholic Church in a world of social media, right? So, one of the things that I'm just not totally sure how to deal with as a public figure who sometimes does disagree and agree too with the Holy Father on some core issues is, what is my role, especially as a new Catholic, a Catholic that has some public voice? Like, what should I do when, for example, the Pope issues an order on the Latin Mass that I think is not the right order for the Church? Even though I'm not a big Latin Mass guy, that things like that felt a little bit, it felt wrong, right? I'll not go further than that. So I think one of the big challenges we have is just how to deal with the fact that we have a big church with a lot of disagreements in a world of social media where we need to be unified. We need to follow the core leadership of the church while at the same time actually being able to sort of disagree and have those fundamental arguments about what the church actually represents. I think that's one big challenge. Obviously, the church abuse scandal is a big challenge, and it's one of the reasons why it took me a little while to finally take the plunge from being, interested in the church at an intellectual level to be really, willing to go and do this. But, to me, I think we have to think of the church as our family, and we don't love our families because they're perfect. We love it because they're good and because they're our own. And to me, that's how we should approach the Catholic Church, is this institution. It is certainly not perfect. It has its faults, but it is ours. And we believe in it. We believe in the core truths of the Catholic Church, and we are devoted to it, not because it's always, again, perfect, but because its message is fundamentally correct, and it's the best way that we represent the gospel in a very broken modern world.
So I think it's safe to say you're not a typical Republican. You've been highly critical of the so-called establishment, including Republicans. You recently said, and I quote, "We need fighters who are actually going to fight to rebuild this country, to punish the companies and elites who are destroying it." Who are these elites, and what needs to be done?
Well, they're honestly, they're a lot of the people that I went to law school with, if I'm being direct about it. Look, I forget who, I think it was Justice Holmes who said about pornography, you know it when you see it, right? And I think everybody knows the elites when they see it. It's the people who went to the right schools, they say the right things, they have the right credentials, and they ultimately have most of the control over how our society operates. And my biggest concern as a Republican who thinks about how to solve big problems that exist in our society is I think that our movement, meaning the conservative movement, the Republican Party, that the conservative movement has sort of found its political home in, is we have to recognize the fundamental truth of American public life for conservatives today, and I think Catholic conservatives especially, is that we have lost every significant institution in this country. It is a stark fact, but it's true. We've lost the universities, we've lost the media, we've lost the technology sector, we've lost Wall Street, we've lost our biggest businesses. You see this in any number of ways, but the simple fact is that the biggest institutions, whether in the private or the public sector, are actively hostile to some of our values. Now, I think about this in a number of different ways, but I was told a few months ago by a friend in Middletown, Ohio, which is where I grew up, a middle-class guy, he has 5 kids, he supports his family on this middle-class wage, and he nearly lost his job because he posted something on Facebook that somebody didn't like, and some of his Facebook friends, I put that in scare quotes, ganged up on him, called his employer, said this person is offensive, is cancelable, and tried to get him fired from his job. Now, in that world, we have to rethink what are our priorities and how do we actually accomplish our vision of society. And I unfortunately think that the natural instincts that we have in this moment, the classic principles that conservatives rely on, things that I don't disagree with. So limited government, we want lower taxes, we want all these things that really matter. But if you're lowering the taxes of the companies that then take their lower tax revenue and fund anti-American protest movements that destroy our cities, or if they send literature into our schools that are teaching our children that they're bad people or that their country is fundamentally a bad place, does that actually make sense anymore? And I think the answer is no. We are not in a world where we find ourselves on the side of businesses, and we need to acknowledge that fact. The most stark and obvious example of this In 2018, I think maybe 2017, then Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, in arguing against abortion restrictions in Georgia, said these restrictions are bad for business. And her argument was pretty straightforward, and honestly, it was true. Her argument was, if we pass these abortion restrictions, these businesses are going to pull money, jobs, and investment capital out of our state. Now, I disagree with her values, but she was right. Georgia suffers, Ohio suffers, a lot of states suffer from abortion restrictions because the business community is actively pro-abortion in this country. What do we do with that fact? If our answer is to continue to give more power to the business community that's combating our values, what we're doing is sacrificing the life of the unborn and our future on the altar of these companies.
You recently told Fox News' host Tucker Carlson, who I understand is a good friend of yours, and I quote, "You have elites and ruling class that have plundered the country. They have made it harder for middle-class Americans to live a normal life. And when those Americans dare to complain about the conditions of their own country, if they dare to complain about the southern border or about jobs getting shipped overseas, what do they get called? They get called racists. They get called bigots, xenophobes, or idiots. They need someone who's willing to speak for them, who's willing to fight for them." Is America a racist country?
No, I don't think that it is. In fact, I think we're probably the least racist country in the entire world. And I think that's not to say that we're perfect, but I think it's something to be proud of. I think we should be proud of the fact that most people in this country look at those, whether they're the same skin color or different, they look at them as people with values and virtue and character independent of their skin color. That's something to be proud of. Now, I was exposed to this in a very unique way because after 2016, even though I was not a big fan of Donald Trump in 2016, this book came out and there were all of these questions asked about me. Well, aren't the Trump voters racist? Isn't the thing that's going on is that these people are motivated by racism? And I think about my dad, I think about my mom, I think about my aunt and uncle, people who sort of got excited about Trump in a way that I haven't seen them excited about a political candidate in a long time. And it's like, no, of course these people aren't racist. And at first I just thought it was a ridiculous thing. It was this weird thing that I didn't fully understand. But then I started to realize that the accusation of racism that's levied against normal Americans is an effort to silence them by powerful people. And this is worth repeating. When you take normal middle-class Americans who, let's say, they're worried about the southern border because they don't want heroin to come in their communities that's going to kill their children and grandchildren. When you tell them they're not allowed to complain about that, and if they do, they're racist, what you're really telling them to do is shut up. And you're taking the thing that is best about our country, our compassion for one another, our desire to judge people not based on the color of their skin, and you're using it as a weapon against middle-class Americans who just want to actually have a better country to live in. And that recognition was really powerful to me because, again, a lot of the elites, a lot of the ruling class, they don't really care if we have a country that's less racist or more racist. They use this as a rhetorical weapon to silence good people who care about the future of their children, and that is disgusting.
So you just mentioned him. You once described yourself as never Trump. You called him an idiot. You described him as cultural heroin. I suspect many of us in the room, myself included, had our reservations about him in 2016. You've since changed your mind. You said, I think he was a good president. I think he made a lot of good decisions for people, and I think he took a lot of flack for it. How do you answer your critics that say you changed your mind to serve your political ambitions?
Yeah, I guess the most obvious response is if I would have changed my mind to serve my political ambitions, I would have changed my mind 3 weeks ago and not 3 years ago. And so the fact that I've been very publicly supportive of some of the Trump administration policies, and the fact that I've been saying I think that he did a good job for the past several years, look, I have been saying that. If you watched me on Tucker Carlson in 2018, it was pretty clear that I thought Trump, whatever your disagreements with him might be, that he was actually doing a pretty good job for the country. And that is simply not compatible with changing my mind 3 years later so that I could run for political office. So I think that's response number one. I think response number two is many of the people, to just be direct, many of the people who are leveling criticisms at me for not being pro-Trump enough are frankly people who said much more negative and much more critical things about the president more recently than I did. And so this idea that I had some sort of evolution on Trump is true. The idea that I had like a come to Jesus moment 3 weeks ago so that I could run for the Senate, it's just totally bogus. And I think anybody who can actually watch the tape knows where I'm coming from. Look, I am not a, I would like to think I'm decent at politics. I've been at it for 3 weeks. I am not a natural politician in the sense that I'm not going to pretend that every single thing that any politician has done in my entire life that I agree with 100% of it. I met with President Trump a few months ago, and we had a very good conversation. We spent over an hour together, but he definitely let me know. He's like, "Look, I agree with a lot of what you're doing, but you were very critical of me in 2016." He has a very long memory, but I think that what we have to do in the conservative movement is recognize that what Trump did for this party and for this movement is rip the Band-Aid off on a lot of old orthodoxies. Because 30, 40 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was conventional wisdom in the Republican Party that we should be totally fine with shipping our manufacturing base off to China because we were going to get cheap consumer goods in response. Well, my community got a lot of unemployed, especially unemployed fathers. They got a lot of opioid abuse, and we now have a country that doesn't make some of the critical ingredients that it relies on. So I think that Trump's great contribution to the country, and I don't think that contribution is necessarily done, is to make us realize that unless you're putting your own citizens first, unless you're making things in your own country, you don't have a real country anymore. And that, to me, is the lesson that we should take from the Trump administration.
So I want to ask, just yesterday, you created a bit of a stir by criticizing politicians running the country who do not have a personal, indirect stake, as you put it, in improving because they do not have children. You specifically called out future Democratic Party presidential aspirants, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, Senator Cory Booker, and AOC. You said, and I quote, "When you go to the polls in this country as a parent, you should have more power. You should have more of an ability to speak your voice in our democratic republic than people who don't have kids. Quote, let's face the consequences, you said. If you don't have as much of an investment in the future of this country, maybe you shouldn't get nearly the same voice." What do you mean by that?
Well, turns out I got in trouble for that one. But look, my basic view is that if the Republican Party, if the conservative movement stands for anything, and I'm running as a politician trying to advocate for what we should stand for, the number one thing that we should be is pro-babies and pro-families. That's what this whole thing is all about. We have, I believe, a civilizational crisis in this country where we have unhealthy families, we have families falling apart, we have the rise of childhood trauma, and even among healthy, intact families, they're not having enough kids such that we're going to have a long-term future in this country. The Declaration of Independence is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you don't have babies, if you don't have life, you do not have a future country. And we have to face this fact. Now, the basic argument that I made last night is twofold. And I'll reiterate, even though I'm sure I'll get in trouble tonight too. One, so many of the most miserable and unhappy people in our media and in our public life are people without kids. And I think that they were trained to chase credentials, to chase degrees, to chase money, when the thing that is ultimately going to give you the most fulfillment in life is your family. Now, I want to be clear here. I know a lot of people who do not have children, and my goal here is not to criticize people. You know, they haven't found the right person. They've chosen a life of celibacy. For medical reasons, they're unable to have kids. My goal here is not to criticize every single person who doesn't have children. My goal is to point out a very simple fact that it's one thing to have a society where you don't have, where some people don't have kids. It's another thing to build an entire political movement that is explicitly anti-child and anti-family. And that's what the left in this country is. It is anti-child and anti-family. Just one example. One of the politicians that I criticize is AOC. Now, AOC, it's one thing, okay, maybe AOC hasn't found the right person, whatever the case may be, but when AOC has said, basically, if you look at her public remarks on this, that it's immoral to have children because of climate change concerns, right? This is, let's just be direct, a sociopathic attitude towards families. And I think somebody just has to point this out, and it's a little bit weird. Now, Pope Francis called this out in Europe, and he himself got in a lot of trouble, because when Theresa May was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, I believe, and a couple of other countries, none of their leaders had children. What does it say about our civilization that so many of our leaders don't have kids? What does it say about the incentives that are built in to the Democrats' entire movement, that they reward the young people who don't have families instead of the young people who do? I think it's just pretty sick. Let's be honest. It's pretty sick, and it suggests something pretty broken.
So Catholics in this room are very familiar with what's been termed the culture war.
Sure.
That's been largely defined as the belief that the insights of our Catholic Church, grounded in science and natural law, on questions such as abortion, marriage, and religious liberty, must be defended for both the good of persons and of society as a whole. You've described the culture war as class war. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is another comment that's got me in trouble. You're hitting all the JD greatest hits here, I see. So two ways in which I think that the culture war is a class war. The first, and the most obvious, is that this is true in both the Republican Party, but in the Democrats as well, that the most socially conservative demographics in the party are the working and middle class people. So take the Democrats, for example. The only pro-life constituency within the Democratic Party are middle-class black Americans. You talk to people in elite circles, to use that term again, and very often if you're at a Republican function, a conservative function, whatever the case may be, you will hear people say, well, I am fiscally conservative, but I'm socially liberal. But you talk to my family, or you talk to most of the grassroots voters that are voting for the GOP, they frankly do not care whether Amazon pays a 12% tax rate or a 7% tax rate. What they care is that we protect the life of the unborn. And so many of our middle class people are more focused on the social and cultural issues than on the economic issues. So the first part is just that if we want to actually represent and respect the middle and working class voters who make up our party, we have to be willing to represent their cultural values. These are not people who want to teach their kids that they come from a fundamentally racist and evil country. We should not be sending that message as a political movement and as a party. But the second thing is that we have this weird conceit, I think, among conservative leaders that the culture war just happens at the level of social and cultural relations. We think that, it's all about social pressure. Why are people afraid to say they're pro-life? Why are people afraid to say that they're pro-marriage? It's because that it's sort of socially unconventional or unacceptable to say. But that is a naive viewpoint given how crazy corporate America has got. Because there are real economic and financial penalties for being a social conservative in this country. It's as simple as that. That if you utter socially conservative viewpoints, if you don't want to bake a cake, to take a totally hypothetical example, that has viewpoints that you don't agree with, if you post something on your Facebook as a middle-class Ohioan that the mob doesn't like, it's not just that they'll pressure you, it's that they'll punish you economically. And unless we wake up in this movement and recognize that our enemies are fighting us not just with cultural pressure, but with economic pressure, we're going to lose the culture war because they're fighting it on all fronts.
I just have a few more questions here, but a term that some associate with your political vision and policy ideas is what has come to be called common good conservatism. That is a vision for American politics that prioritizes or that breaks the traditional left-right, Democrat, Republican categories of the last several decades, and instead prioritizes economic and social policies that prioritize families, children, and the working class. What is common good conservatism, and can you give us just a few ideas of what you think that represents?
Yeah, so to me, and to go back to something that Pope Leo XIII said in the famous encyclical Rerum Novarum in the late 19th century is, the economy exists to serve the human person. The human person does not exist to serve the economy. And I think that's the fundamental insight. Now look, there are all kinds of disagreements that we can have about the specific policies, but I think oftentimes when we talk about economic policy, we talk about it in a way as if the focus of it, the overall goal of it, is not to maximize human welfare or life and happiness, but it's to maximize, one very abstract economic indicator. And I think that's what, if anything, common good conservatism is a pushback. And it's like, let's focus. Look, we might have disagreements on policy. We don't have to discard important principles, but we need to respect that a given thing might reduce the GDP by 0.1%, but might still be a good idea because it's good for our families and it's good for our children. That's, to me, common good conservatism. So just to take like one very basic example, right? I think that we need to do something about the technology sector in this country. We need to do something about the fact that if you are a 7-year-old boy or a 12-year-old boy, you can go on the internet in this country and access the most ridiculous and absurd filth known to man. Now, if we, let's say, for example, a policy that I support, absolutely hard ban on pornography for minors, again, now there are people in our movement who will say, well, what about the coders who produce the web services that send that pornography to people? What about all of the people who are generating that pornography? They're good jobs. Fundamentally, what we should be focused on is the freedom of the pornographer, not the virtue of our children. That is an argument that's rooted in economics first, and my argument is we should be rooted in people first. Ban the pornography for underage kids. Get it out of our communities. That's just one example, but I think again, look, the question about what do we do about the technology sector, right? My view is that we should break up big tech. I think that so long as these companies are so powerful, it makes it impossible for normal Americans to have a real stake in their society because their voices are always going to be censored by these hyper-powerful technology companies. Now look, other people may disagree. I've had conversations even today with people who think the better solution is, look, we need to have better private investment in some of the competitors to the big technology sector. That's a totally valid viewpoint. Let's disagree with it. Let's argue about it. Let's come to some agreement on what we do about this stuff. But the fundamental premise is we should be doing what's best, not for our GDP, not for some economic abstraction, but for the people who live in this country and the children who depend on it.
Well, I think the last 20-25 minutes we've spent is probably the best outline of common good conservatism that I've heard to date, and so thank you so much. My final question to you is that the state motto of Ohio, some of you in Ohio may know this, is fittingly, with God, all things are possible.
Sure.
Win or lose next year, as an American Catholic, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that for 300 years in our country and 2,000 years in the Catholic Church, God has always shown that He's faithful and that He's in control. I think that one of the great lessons of the very long history of the Church is that Yeah, sometimes things seem really bad. And yeah, even over multiple generations, it's not totally clear that there's a way forward. But our faith lies not that we're going to be successful personally in the next election or the next decade. It lies not in the fact that we're going to win any temporal battle that we see before us. It lies in the fact that we serve Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ is in control, and that he ultimately determines the fate of the world. That, to me, is reason enough for hope. Now, all that said, I really hope God's will is not for me to lose this election next year. And what also gives me hope, in a little bit more specific way, is I look at the Republican Party and the conservative movement today. I look at the people in this room, some of the conversations I've had today, some of the conversations I've had over the last few months, and I think that for the first time in my life, I feel like this movement is very focused on the nature of the problem and what we need to do to solve it over the long term. Which is not to say that 20 years ago we weren't focused on important problems, but there seems to be a real consensus emerging in our movement for what's gone wrong in this country and how to push back against it. I believe, I really do, that the next 30 years in this country is going to be really exciting, really prosperous, and really good for Christian virtue and the values that we care about. So I'm not just putting my faith in the long term. I actually think there's a reason to hope that in the medium term, we are going to be successful and we are going to win, and the people of this country will benefit from it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next senator from Ohio, JD Vance.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Thank you all.